Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And today we are very pleased to launch Igor Patrick's book, Hearts and Minds and Votes and Contracts, China's State Media in Latin America, the result of several years' work in China and within the region. Igor Patrick's book is the first major study of the impact that Chinese media, including social media, print media, and other forms, are having from Mexico really down to Patagonia, because Mexico and Argentina are both among your 5 case studies. And this book is one of the major works that brings questions about China's overseas influence into the region. The influence concerns, I think, really began, and this is not just because we were involved, but I think that you can make a very strong case with the 2017 publication of the New Zealand scholar Anne-Marie Brady's study, which is called Magic Weapons, which we also published here at the Kissinger Institute. And we have been involved in looking at what has broadly become the influence debate ever since. And we look at it both to call it out where we see it, but also in some cases to criticize excessive focus on what is called influence. This is a complicated story that is mostly focused on the work of China's Tungjianbu, the United Front, and its media in the United States and Europe. And for the past few years, insofar as we looked at other regions, Washington tended to look at Africa and to overlook these questions in South America. And this book, I think, very importantly changes that and takes us into a new era. Igor Patrick, the author, is a journalist with the South China Morning Post's North America Bureau here in Washington. I know that we have a number of Latin America specialists here today who may not know what the South China Morning Post is. It is a Hong Kong-based newspaper which is the largest English-language daily in the Asia Pacific and has been for many decades. It's an extremely influential paper in that region, and it's also read here. Not only is he now a journalist, Igor was our 2022-2023 Schwartzman Fellow here at the Wilson Center. And this is a program we have that brings every year a graduate of Schwartzman College at Tsinghua University in Beijing here for a year of writing to produce a monograph like this one. You will see out front 2 other monographs by Schwartzman Associates, a book by Bradley Jardin, China's Great Wall of Steel, on its extraditions worldwide of Uyghurs and others back into China, and also Lucy Greer's study of China's relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, which she brought out before China Sherpa'd the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So you are in a tradition, a lot to live up to, but you have clearly done it. Igor holds a master's degree in China Studies with a focus on politics and international relations from the Yenjing Academy at Peking University, and also a master's degree in global affairs from Schwartzman College at Tsinghua. He has focused on understanding the impact of China's media strategy in developing countries around the world, but particularly, again, in Latin America and also in Africa. This is not it's his first book-length publication, but it is not his first publication. In addition to the South China Morning Post, he is published in the Huffington Post, the Diplomat, CBN, and Folha de São Paulo, where he covers Chinese affairs weekly and has done so since 2020. He is also involved in, I believe he's one of the founders of a think tank in Brazil, so you may speak about that as well. I've asked Igor first to introduce the major findings and ideas in his book. We will then hear from Sarah Cook, who will serve as discussant today. She's going to be joining us remotely. Sarah is an independent researcher with broad expertise in the region and has looked also at China's overseas influence. She was until recently China Research Director at Freedom House, where she authored the Beijing Global Media Influence Report. So we will hear from Igor, then from Sarah, and then we very much look forward to hearing from all of you. So again, thank you for being here, whether you're with us in person or online. And Igor, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's good to finally put this out there, like after so many years. Two here, and before that also in China and in Latin America as well. Before we start like discussing the topic of the book, I'd like to talk a bit about like how I started like to pay attention to this topic. I've been doing like China journalism for a while now. I think like this year it's going to be like 10 years. And my first time in China was in 2014 for an exchange program at Peking University. And when I went there, like I never planned to be there. Like it was totally out of the blue. It wasn't a for my then like the university where I did my bachelor's. And when I went there and I saw everything, I was like, wow, how come like no one is talking about this back in my country? And I started like to develop an interest in like doing like some independent research until 2019. I went back to China for my master's program at Peking University. And something happened in 2020, COVID, and I got locked outside of China. I was traveling through Southeast Asia. That happened. And I went back to Brazil, and then like many media outlets started like reaching out because they were looking for journalists with expertise in China affairs. And I noticed that one of the main TV networks in Brazil, Band, they were doing this like news segment on China for like 10 to 15 minutes every day. And I never heard about it. And I started like paying attention. At some point, I even applied for a job there until I realized it was actually a segment produced by CCTV.
China Central Television.
Yeah. And I was like, well, if I'm a journalist familiar with this topic, following what's happening between like Latin America and Brazil, and initially I couldn't distinguish if this was like original independent journalism on China and like a production made by a state media, I'm sure like many people don't know as well. So like my first master's thesis, the one that I wrote for the Yinqing Academy, was evaluating how effective that TV segment was with the Brazilian audience, so whether like it was changing minds on like how to perceive China's rise and so on. And I noticed that like many people would be indifferent, especially like, so what I did was basically like gathering dozens of surveys with like hundreds of people, and basically showing them like a segment of this TV show together with a documentary that one of the main networks in Brazil broadcast back in 2020 on the pandemic in Wuhan, and see how people would react. So first they would watch the video, and then they would say, okay, so I think it's true, I think it's not true, I think it makes me think positively on China, I think it makes like me look negatively on China. And I noticed that many people would be neutral, but then when informed that that production was made by Chinese state media, many would say that like that didn't change the perception at all. Actually, in some cases, we had people saying that because it was produced by the Chinese, they trust more on that content than if it was like produced by a local broadcast company. Some other people say that like before they were okay with the content because they thought it was like something original coming from the TV stations and newspapers that they like read or watch every day, and then like they would be like, okay, so I wasn't able to identify that it was made by the Chinese. Now I have concerns. So I started like paying attention to this. This is a topic that I continue researching at Tsinghua, and it's finally he has an expanded like research on the topic. So like in terms of like the strategy, this is not necessarily new, like this need that the Chinese have to have a voice in the global stage. This dates back all the way to the Kuomintang era, actually. At that time, there were like discussions on like how the West would be xenophobic towards the Chinese. They wouldn't allow the Chinese to have a voice and to present their perspectives on things. And when Mao took over in 1949, that trend continued. But of course, at that time, the main focus for like all these media outlets was like to influence the world in terms of like socialism narratives, right? Like, so most of it was influenced by, so like it was made for like socialist countries, for like countries inclined to socialism. So it wasn't really something to necessarily challenge the West. But then, and we also had like some of these media outlets working as de facto embassies for China. So like we know that before the U.S. Recognized mainland China as like the one China, many countries didn't have relations with China. So Xinhua would be this de facto channel of communication between the Chinese government in Beijing and many countries without like formal relations.
Xinhua, there's not what that is. That's what that is.
Yeah.
Right now, no.
Xinhua is the prime news agency in China. It's a state news agency. It is often the only media outlet allowed in many meetings, like private meetings, and usually the first and the only one authorized to report on like sensitive stuff in China as well, because it follows the party line. So yeah. And then like this started to change in 1987 when, as part of like all the economic reforms China was going through in that period, they decided to consider media as a commodity. So it gave them a push to export the content, to look at this strategy in a more like commercial way. And I would say like the big push was the 2008 Olympic Games. At that time, as you all remember, China spent billions and billions of dollars to present the country as this new global superpower, right? Like the China was finally back in the global stage after so many decades. And that included a huge investment in like the capacity of CCTV to become a global media outlet as well. But then, like when everyone was expecting that to like generate some soft power for China, we had the riots against like Tibet repression that year. Some of you might remember that even the torch relay at that year had to be interrupted, I think in Paris, because there were so many people protesting against China. And the Chinese, they saw that as like an answer for like this question that they were like asking themselves for so long: will the West accept us as a global superpower? And they understood that they wouldn't. And they had to do something about it. And the way to do something about it was basically to give China a big voice, spending billions and billions of dollars to build this huge strategy on media, especially in the global South. And that's how we see investments at CGTN, CCTV, later CGTN. It was called CCTV, but of course, because how that sounds in English, they rebranded in 2016 to CGTN, China Global Television Network. Xinhua, China Radio International, that are like buying stations all over the world, including in Mexico, at the border between Mexico and the U.S. And we had like this big push from Xi Jinping and this new motto, telling China's story as well, which means like giving China an opportunity to challenge these narratives, to tell stuff from their perspective. And that came, of course, with a lot of money because it became a priority. So in 2013, it was the first time Xi Jinping spoke about this. And we had, since then, like he has been talking about this every time he does like his inspection visits at the headquarters of CCTV in China, when he visits other countries as well. There's also like an occasion described in the book when he went to Chile for a media forum, and he spoke the CELAC there, which is like the office of the UN, and inviting Latin American journalists to go to China and to see things from their perspective, establishing these partnerships with media outlets in the region. This is also like the, where we can point back to like what I consider one of the main strategies right now, which is content sharing agreements. I'm sure Sarah will be talking about that as well in a moment, which is basically signing these contracts with many media outlets, sometimes like for free, sometimes paying them to publish this content. So they go out there, they establish a formal partnership with these media outlets, and then the newspaper will start like publishing a page or two from like the China Daily, or a TV station would like broadcast a segment produced by CCTV and so on. They use this here in the US as well. I believe the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, they both published some paid pages by the Chinese for a while, but then because of the backlash and how like the media, the rest of the media reacted to this, they stopped. But this is a strategy going strong in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. And it's very interesting to see the dynamics of how this works. So, like throughout the region, like doing the interviews for this book, I've heard, for example, some journalists from these media outlets say, well, I don't have control over what gets published or not, because this is a partnership they sign directly with the owners of the media outlets. Very often, these media outlet owners, they have business in other areas as well, like agribusiness, mining, and they use these partnerships as like a door to mainland China and to business in mainland China. Also, like in other occasions, like you will see like media outlets struggling financially speaking, which seems to be the case like all over the world, unfortunately. And these content sharing agreements and the amount of money they pay, it's like a lifeline for many of these media outlets, which is also a problem because even though it is often just a page or perhaps like a special issue, like every 2 or 3 months, many of these media outlets, they stop reporting negative things on China because they need the money. In fact, we have a case in Mexico where the journalist, she got a tip from Human Rights Watch on the Mexican ambassador to the UN in Geneva visiting Xinjiang in China without letting everyone know about it. And then when she was about to publish the story, the owner of the newspaper called her asking what she was doing. And she was like, what do you mean what I'm doing? This is news. And he was like, but no one in Mexico cares about these Muslims in Xinjiang. She ended up like still publishing the story, but she also told me that when there's something like negative on the newspaper, very often like the owners of the newspaper would offer the Chinese embassy, for example, in the region, like an opportunity to like write against what they publish and to give like a perspective on that. This is also the case in Chile. In Argentina is also a very interesting dynamics because they took advantage of like the economic struggles in Argentina when Cristina Kirchner was still the president there. And they first signed content sharing agreements with like friendly newspapers with the Kirchners. When she started like going down politically speaking, and all the opposition media there, they also started like losing readers and viewers because like the new government was like center right at that time. Then they offered the same sort of like agreement to like the other newspapers in a way that like right now in Argentina, there is a big chance that like most of the media outlets that reach like almost the entire country, they have some sort of partnership with the Chinese. It doesn't matter like the ideological standpoint of these media outlets. Also, something that I find very interesting is the strategy they use for social. So like when I started like researching about that TV segment in Brazil, I noticed like there was a journalist publishing content in Portuguese, and she worked for them, like for Chinese state media. And she had like hundreds of thousands of likes on Facebook, even though like I never heard about her. And as I started like digging deeper, I saw like the same thing was happening not only in Latin America, but also in Africa and Southeast Asia. What's the strategy? They usually spend a lot of money trying to build a profile for these journalists, trying to make them like local influencers in that region. Most of the content is very innocent. It revolves around like Chinese culture, Chinese cuisine, but some of them, like from time to time, they would like put something controversial in the middle of all of this. So they would like criticize the West on the approach of China. They would talk about like the human rights issues from a Chinese standpoint. Recently, they have been pushing this idea of like democracy with Chinese characteristics as well, trying to convince people that China is a democracy. And what is very interesting, at least for me, is the fact that like it's very localized. So if you have like one of these journalists focusing on Peru, for example, they would find someone within like the lines in the newsroom that can speak Spanish with a Peruvian accent, so people can relate. Same thing for like the page in Brazil, like the girl doing content for Brazil now. Oh, by the way, she has more than 1.3 million followers on Facebook.
Chinese influencer.
Yes. she does it in Brazilian Portuguese, even though she graduated in Portugal. And before joining this strategy, she used to do content for Portuguese people, like playing fado, which is like a kind of like a genre, and this kind of stuff. And it's funny because like they don't like when they get labeled as China state owned media. Like this journalist in Brazil, for example, after she received this label from, at that time, Facebook, now Meta, she made a video saying, "Oh, I don't understand why I got this label. Maybe because I'm a journalist, but you know that it's not related to what I do at all. I think it's like this xenophobia in the West on like categorizing every Chinese journalist as part of the state media apparatus." That was false in her case, but we also have cases, and I think I made this distinction in the book as well, with journalists, Chinese journalists purely interested in like showing things from their perspective that not necessarily are sponsored by this state media. In fact, I even quoted like a journalist saying that she feels that because of this dynamic between the US and China right now, everyone looks at her and thinks she's like a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party. And that's one of the reasons why dealing with this issue is so difficult and so sensitive, because like in some of these countries in Latin America, there is already this tendency of like censoring newspapers and like harassing journalists. And here in the U.S., for example, when Trump started like banning Chinese journalists and like forbidding them from getting visas, for example, for a while there was also like some sort of not for a while, it's still happening, to be honest, like this approach on Chinese journalists, like when people talk to them and when they see them, they immediately assume that they work for the Chinese state, and that's not necessarily true. So it's very difficult to tackle this without incurring problems of like freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and also like, you know, like we had examples recently in the region with like xenophobic leaders going after journalists regardless of their affiliation. And I think like in general, what I describe here is a strategy based on the lack of transparency. These like paid advertorials, this is like the technical name, when you publish journalist content, but like it's paid content. Very often, when they go online on these websites, on newspapers and so on, like the readers or the viewers, they cannot like assess if it is made by like the local journalists or if it is by the Chinese TV. In Colombia, for example, there is a case where like the main newspaper in Colombia, the newspaper of record there, El Tiempo, they published a whole piece written by Xinhua praising Xi Jinping and so on, without telling the readers that that was actually from Xinhua. And this is like, I saw that like over and over and over again, going through like multiple examples described here. And for me, like the problem of this is that like perhaps like watching CGTN and like listening to China Radio International, reading reports from Xinhua, is not something that many people would do. Because like in general, I would say many people, like most people, are familiar with the fact that media is heavily censored in China, so they don't tend to like give them credibility to talk about this sort of topics. But when you see the same thing on like the newspaper that you read every day, the TV station that you've been watching since you're a kid, you tend to attribute then the same level of like trust that you attribute to the local journalists, right? And that's a problem. Yeah, I think we should go over to Sarah. I've been speaking a lot, so.
So I would like to go to Sarah Cook, but first I wanted to mention I was remiss in not doing this right up front. Benjamin, when I saw you wander in, I thought, wait a minute, I forgot to mention that this program today is also co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Latin America program, by our Beijing Institute, and also by our Mexico Institute, so that many of the people online and here in the room are participate in those programs in their outreach, and we're very glad to have you here today. So if we could now go to Sarah Cook, who joins us remotely from New York, for a response and perhaps expansion on the themes that Igor has raised. So we'll go to Sarah, we'll then let Igor briefly respond, and then we'll go, I have some questions, but I'm sure that there are many questions in the room, so I'll let you ask questions first, and I will step in when there are opportunities. But let's first go to Sarah up in New York.
Thank you very much. And it's really, I'm so glad that it worked out that I could join remotely. And really congratulations to Igor on this book. It's really fascinating. I mean, I'm going to speak a little bit. So much of what he said fits with the findings that we had from our research. But just adds this extra grassroots element of really talking to people in the newsrooms at a level that expands upon what we did. So at Freedom House, we did this big Beijing's Global Media Influence report. It was a study of 30 countries, looking both at the Beijing's media influence, but also at local response and resilience. And we covered 7 or 8 countries in Latin America. I think overall our findings were, and this kind of fits, with what Igor was saying, was a general trend of expansion on the part of the Chinese government and Communist Party and state media, but also, again, this adaptation of the tactics and strategies, because after an initial expansion that was perhaps focused more on Chinese state media themselves trying to reach local audiences directly, and finding that it doesn't always, people just don't watch it, on their own. They're not going to go, even if it's on cable stations, they're just not going to go to CGTN. And then really doubling down on what the party calls barring the boat to reach the sea. And that's this element of working through the local mainstream and sometimes not so mainstream media in different countries to reach local audiences and to get to audiences at the media outlets they're working on. And we've really seen an expansion of this and I've been following this space for 10, 15 years, looking at this kind of media evolution. And even I was surprised. So in just the 30 countries we looked at, we counted 130 media outlets that had some kind of content partnership agreement with Chinese outlets. Sometimes it was provincial government. Sometimes it was an entity with close party ties like Huawei. But it was really country after country, the mainstream media. And like Igor said, in many cases, it was across the political spectrum. And it was, politically diverse, geographically diverse. In many places, it was kind of the national media and then also some of the local outlets. You see this element of after they've kind of gotten into some of the main outlets, starting to look at maybe not fringe, but like subsections that serve certain populations, maybe another language or something like that. So really reaching a wide range of individuals. And while it often gets attention in the print media, seeing more and more of it happening in broadcast media. And I think this element of transparency, as Igor mentioned, is really important because often the labeling is either non-existent or obscured. And while in print, it might say, oh, this is an advertisement, or sometimes it'll say, explain that this is from the PRC. Broadcast media, it's even harder because also sometimes people will be joining part way. So the labeling is even weaker in terms of whether audiences can know what the content is. So I think that's one thing. And then also in terms of the expansion, so we counted 16 out of the 30 countries where there was the new agreement signed just in this period of 2019 to 2021. That was our focus, including some countries like Argentina. I think Colombia was another. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that both it's something that we see in Latin America, but I think we see it worldwide. What struck me in Latin America was this element of, because the media is concentrated and the ownership is concentrated in so many countries, it works even better than elsewhere, right? If you have a more fragmented media landscape, then they have to go to more outlets. But when you have these big conglomerates that are owned by a particular family, then just one agreement with one or two owners, and some of them cross, from one country to another. Some have regional influence as well. It's actually very efficient on the part of Chinese state media. I think the other thing Igor mentioned is this the way in which propaganda and censorship are two sides of the same coin. And we've seen this again and again, because you end up with the relationship starting as one that we would see as content promotion or kind of more propagandistic, but it ends up being a point of economic and political leverage that is then actually used for censorship. And one of the first places you really saw this was in Taiwan, actually. Exactly what Igor was describing, media owners with other financial interests in other sectors in China, and that would be used to get them to suppress certain coverage in their own media outlet. One thing that I think the other thing where you see that kind of spread and maybe Igor remembers this paper more, but this example of this program in Brazil, and I don't remember if this was the paper you did, or I think somebody else maybe did, where they actually looked at the content across media in Brazil, both at that station, but also otherwise, and found that there was a difference before and after the launch of this daily news program in terms of how much more critical content there was. And there was less criticism of China after the launch. And it wasn't only in this one outlet that was running this program, but across a number of others in terms of, especially if it's a major outlet that's something of an agenda setter. So I think that's actually really important in terms of when we look at the impact, because look, the flip side of it is that when you look at public opinion polls about China, they're doing pretty badly. Because I think that was the other aspect of our project, was really, what was the actual impact? What's the local resilience and response? And I think both journalists and news consumers, especially in more democratic settings, are pretty savvy. And that's one reason for the obscuring and the lack of transparency, right? But so you see kind of public opinion vis-a-vis China or the Xi Jinping personally declining, and that's not only related a reflection of media coverage. But I think you do then, but I think you also see that, that I think if we just look at the impact of the content they're producing as an indicator of impact, that's not enough. You need kind of the full spectrum of where this goes into the censorship dynamics and the incentives for certain coverage. And I think part of it is increasingly not only whether an outlet will report on, say, what's happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang or things like that, but the local investments. And that's one of the things I think where you can really get an intersection also also threats for journalists in terms of the powerful local actors who have incentives. So if you're trying to investigate a mine or something like that in the environment, you're now not only going up against a Chinese company, but the local powerful stakeholders. I don't know if that's an example or some area that Igor can maybe speak to a little bit more. On the social media influencer, that's also something we saw again and again. Look, it's good for them that they're investing so much in the linguistic diversity. I mean, it's not only languages like Spanish or even Portuguese that are spoken by a relatively large number of people. Hebrew, Italian, Romanian, Swahili, like languages that are maybe spoken by a few million people around the world. And you have influencers like this, very savvy, very charming often, and really they're very good. But again, that connection is obscured. And again, it's not only necessarily by the Chinese state outlets. The local outlets often may have their own interest in obscuring it. And there were controversies in Israel, for example. There's this I happen to speak Hebrew. And I was just so impressed with this guy's Hebrew. It was just amazing and just super charming. And then during COVID, he was brought on primetime news shows to talk about the situation in China. And they wouldn't necessarily say he was China Radio International. And so that created controversies in terms of the journalistic ethics in these countries. And so I think, and I'll just wrap up here. I think there's more to maybe talk about. I'm happy to speak about the response and the resilience. But I think in terms of, we just saw in so many places, first of all, this awareness of the risks and of the downside that we've seen in discussions in the US or in Europe or in Australia. It's increasingly evident in places in Africa and beginning in Latin America. Latin America, it's kind of very just starting. And conversations among journalists and journalist unions. And how do we respond to that? As well as very creative and impressive use of investigative journalism, of FOIA requests, to find out what the money trail is, to expose some of these financial ties between local officials and Chinese entities and how that plays out. There was an example in Peru. There were examples in Nigeria. And I think that's important and meaningful because there's a lot of local agency. And I think whether it's in terms of what governments can do, where they're sometimes slower, but you do see various regulatory elements that when enforced, and transparency rules, investment screening, can really do a long way to safeguarding against some of the negative or more corrupting or covert elements. But again, allowing China to speak because, we're democracies and they also have a right to speak. We don't want to be censoring them. But we do need to have, there are safeguards. There is a malign element here that we want to safeguard against. And just the role of journalists and civil society is so important because just one piece of investigative journalism really on this issue that exposes it is very impactful in terms of raising public and policymaker awareness. And I think Igor's book, hopefully it'll be translated in Spanish or Portuguese. That's maybe a question for you all. Could be really impactful in terms of people seeing that this is a pattern. It's not like, because they'll see one incident and think, oh, I just got a call from the Chinese embassy to cut this story, or oh, I just got invited, and they don't know the bigger picture. And that again in of itself helps foster resilience when people have more awareness. So I hope I wasn't speaking too long. I'll stop there. Really impressive piece of work, Igor, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Igor, anything that you want to respond to Sarah on? But what about this question about publishing this in Spanish or Portuguese? Do you think that there are prospects for that?
I hope so. We've been talking about it for the past few weeks. We'll see. We've been talking first on publishing in Portuguese. I hope Spanish version follows suit very soon. Just to comment on a few things that Sarah mentioned. So about this research she mentioned on the effects of this TV segment in that TV network in Brazil. One of the authors of this research is actually the one that authored the afterword of the book, Paulo Menecheli. Not only he's an excellent scholar analyzing the soft power strategy, the Chinese soft power strategy in Latin America, but he's also a good friend. We are co-founders of a think tank in Brazil called Observa China. And I actually, I have the page here where I mentioned this study. So what they did was to analyze thousands of stories on China at this news TV network compared to the competitors in Brazil. The TV network is called Band, but they compared with SBT, Record, TV Brazil, CNN Brazil, and BBC News Brazil, and they discovered that after signing this agreement, there was a reduction of 15.2% in negative reports on China post-launch of this TV segment, and a 6.3 increase percent in positive coverage. Also, Bungie has had a lower percentage of reports pointing to China as a threat since the signing of the agreement, 20.5%, while the average of the other channels was 26.2%. I actually went to the newsroom to talk to the person who signed this agreement, and we discussed a very specific situation. So during the pandemic, when Jair Bolsonaro was still the president of Brazil, one of his sons, Eduardo, is also a representative at the House in Brazil. He posted a tweet saying that what the Chinese were doing regarding COVID was similar to what the Soviet Union did with Chernobyl, in the sense of concealing critical information that would help save lives and so on. And the Chinese investor at that time, he immediately posted a response to this, demanding Bolsonaro and his sons to apologize to the Chinese people. The next day, this TV network, which notoriously support Bolsonaro when he was running for the presidency, they published this editorial criticizing the administration and calling Bolsonaro an idiot, and calling the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time also other names. And I asked them, why did you do this? And they were like, it was intentional. We had to protect the Chinese. This relationship is important to Brazil, and we couldn't have the Minister of Foreign Affairs or someone that is directly related to the president talking this kind of stuff against China. And we saw how the ambassador reacted. That was at the peak of the so-called wolf warrior strategy, where Chinese diplomats were responding sometimes very aggressively on criticism about China on social media. And of course, the owners of this TV network, they also have business with China in other areas, right? The family is well known for having a lot of business in agribusiness, for example. They also told me they were looking for help from the Chinese to modernize the satellite infrastructure they have currently. So there are other interests involved, and we can see that after signing this contract with the Chinese, the amount of like negative coverage reduced, which is successful for them. But I don't know if that's like in the best interest of the audience as well. I also would like to point out something that like very often when I talk about this topic, especially here in the U.S., people come and say, well, yeah, but like they're not very successful, are they? Like no one pays attention to this. And against this like common sense, last year, a group of scholars at Harvard, and together with like other scholars from a university in Sweden that I cannot pronounce the name, they decided to analyze more than 19,000 CGTN videos and
Sorry, CGTN is China Global Television Network. It's the rebranding of China Central Television internationally. So sometimes you'll hear CCTV, which is the old branding. CGTN, same thing, rebranded.
Yeah. So like they analyzed 19,000 CGTN video segments posted on YouTube. And they compared how more than 6,000 individuals in 19 countries, I have the list here, but they are not only countries in the global south. It's Argentina, Australia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Kenya, Mexico, Nigeria, Peru, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, South Africa, Spain, the UAE, and the UK. They compared how these people would rate this videos compared to content produced by Voice of America and videos published by the State Department. And just to summarize, like for those interested, this is like page 52 of the book, on the book. But yeah, like some of the findings that they could like verify with this research, there were exposure to messages from Chinese state media that commend the high performance of the Chinese government can effectively generate support for China's economical and political model. Considering the limited reach of Chinese state media, exposure to new information about China is more likely to shift international public opinion towards Chinese beliefs and values than information about the United States. When faced with conflicting messages from democratic and autocratic countries, the public tends to favor the autocratic model. State media from authoritarian regimes tend to be more successful in developing countries, and Chinese state media offer a fresh perspective on China and are thus particularly effective in boosting approval for the Chinese government, even though they fall short of convincing people of its democratic nature. So yeah, I think like because many people assume that like this is not effective, they tend to simply ignore the whole thing, and this is a concern. In terms of reach, Sarah mentioned the fact that like some of these media outlets, they have reached beyond the borders of the country. There's a specific case in Colombia. So like the main TV station in Colombia, Caracol, they are the founders of the Latin American Information Alliance, which is an alliance with, I think, right now, almost 30 news stations around the region, including CBS here in the U.S. And they have an active partnership together with the Chinese, like back in 2019, 2020, I'm sorry, I forget. They participated in a media forum together with the Chinese where they announced this new strategy to push for like co-producing content for both Latin American and Chinese audiences. And when like a content, for example, is distributed by this alliance, assuming that like all the members decided to pick it up, you have TV stations all over the region, like beyond like those that I mentioned here. So like page 171, like the members of this alliance, we have a TV station in Argentina, Guatemala, Brazil, Honduras, Uruguay, El Salvador, Colombia, here in the US, CBS, Ecuador, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Aruba, Curacao, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Mexico, Spain, Panama, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Puerto Rico. So yeah, like one story can be distributed to all of these people in all of these regions, and of course, like the impact is significant. So yeah, in general, I would say for many years, the U.S. like it was like the prime example of like collaboration in many areas, and something that used to happen quite often and is not very common anymore. It's like inviting some journalists to the U.S. to work with peers here in like established newsrooms, and I think this would be so important because like talking to these people out there and interviewing like many journalists in these newsrooms, what I often heard was like, oh, we don't have people with like expertise on China. Like we don't have reporters that can speak Chinese. Like many of my reporters here, like they know nothing about China, so they don't know how to begin. And like going back to what Sarah mentioned about investments, sometimes they have some expertise in analyzing investments, but they don't know the technicalities of getting data from Chinese companies, for example, because it's very different. They don't know how to reach executives of these Chinese state companies on infrastructure, for example. And in general, it's way harder to talk to the Chinese because like how the country operates, and also the fact that many of these companies, they don't have a PR team. They don't have people like that know how to engage with journalists, and many of like the executives, for example, they are not willing to talk to foreign media at all. So like it would be so important, not only here in the U.S., I would say, but like for like media outlets with a very well-proved track of covering China, to invite journalists from these regions to come here and understand with them. I don't think the U.S. should necessarily be sponsoring like anti-China content because, I mean, that goes against everything that I wrote in the book. But I think it would be important to like give a way for these journalists interested in these aspects to learn with their peers here in Europe or even in Taiwan, for example. They have been doing this for so long. They know exactly how the state media operates. And they've been doing a very good job so far on resisting to this sort of strategies and putting like independent content out there. So yeah, like I think we should be paying attention to this topic. But this is also like involved with like a bigger problem, right? Which is like the lack of investments and like in general, like just like the U.S. has stopped paying attention to their own region. It's so focused in the Indo-Pacific now that like, and for so long the U.S. sort of like thought that like Latin America, because it is close to the U.S., it's sort of within the sphere of influence. They start paying attention to this kind of stuff, and this is the result.
China's paying attention. Let's go to audience questions. Please do pull a microphone over and push the green button and identify yourself, and we'll start with Benjamin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and thanks for the partnership on this terrific event. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the flip side of what you just recommended. You recommended U.S. government or U.S. news media companies engaging with journalists in Latin America. The flip side being China and Chinese state media companies engaging with journalists in Latin America. From what I understand, the mission of those engagements is not simply to promote a positive vision of China, but a very different vision of journalism.
Yes.
The idea that journalism is not designed to perform the kind of watchdog function that we think it's supposed to in a democratic society, whether the United States or the democracies of Latin America, and to hold government accountable, but rather a very Chinese and distinct vision of the role of media in a democratic or not democratic culture. So very curious about how you perceive the influence on the practice of journalism in Latin America through these engagements with China.
Great question.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you for co-sponsoring the event. It's a pleasure and an honor. So like I mentioned like at the beginning that in 2017, Xi Jinping was in Chile and he created this like exchange program for local journalists to go to China and learn from China in China. They love like repeating this. And I spoke with some of these journalists who went there. So in general, of course, they want to promote positive coverage of China. So they bring these journalists to like luxurious hotels and like big companies, and they offer them the best like dinners and stuff. But they also don't, very often they don't allow these journalists to go anywhere without someone with them. So we had a case with a Mexican journalist who wanted to go to Tiananmen Square. It was his first time in China, so he was like looking forward to see how it is, the surveillance system there, since there are so many CCTV cameras all over. And he was advised not to. We also have a case, also in Mexico actually, where we had like this very small TV/radio station in a small city in Mexico, not related to China at all, more focused on like domestic news. And then one of the journalists went to to China for this exchange program. When she came back, she sort of became this ambassador of Chinese media in Mexico, and she keeps coming back over and over and over again, and like to the point where this like TV station became almost like a branch of CGTN in Spanish, given the amount of content they reproduce from the Chinese, very often without telling the viewers that it comes from China. So yeah, I totally agree that it tends to. I mean, Robert and I, we were discussing this the other day. Like these days, anything that is not 100% positive on China is negative. So when you have these journalists going there, I would say like almost everyone that I spoke about this issue, they were very aware of like how media censorship works in China. In general, they were aware of like problems with like the political system, human rights violations as well. And most of them were not willing to sell their values and start like publishing pro-China stories. But in some countries, it only takes one. And that's the real concern. Yeah.
Question.
Sorry,
back.
can I add something quick?
Yes, please, Sarah.
Yeah, that diversity in responses was something we saw in many places, but also this element of, again, sometimes the opportunity to go to China creates its own self-censorship pressures.
Yeah.
So many of the people we work with local analysts in all the countries who did interviews and talked to people. And then, so it was kind of a collaborative process. And even though many of the people we would say, look, it'll just be anonymous, we'll just say an anonymous journalist in this country, we won't even say what news outlet. There were some journalists who just wouldn't speak to our analysts. And in a couple of cases, they said, look, I don't want it to even be potentially found out that I did this and spoke critically, and then I wouldn't have a chance to go back to China. And then I think similarly, this element of it just takes one, and we saw examples in Nigeria and elsewhere where even though many journalists were skeptical and actually going to China showed them the repression in real life that they had heard about. Again, it just takes one person to be really active. The last thing on the trainings, and this relates to the US element as well, is it's usually a mix of kind of the propaganda element, but then also real skills in some cases that people do have, especially some of the longer stints. So people will go for 10 months and they're getting real education, Chinese language training, but they're also getting, digital media skills and things like that. So I think it's multifaceted and does bring benefits to the journalists, but doesn't potentially, increase the influence too.
Question here at the back, one, and then two, and then Professor Ellis.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Robert. Igor, it's a huge pleasure to be here. We're very happy to be sharing this amazing moment with you. I just want you to explain a little bit more on the cooperation agreements that were signed and how that can impact, for example, investments and the risking of, in terms of acknowledging and learning a little bit more about the regulatory environment and learning what's going on in these countries from the Chinese perspective via the investments that they are planning to do or they want to do or they are actually doing in some of the infrastructure, in some of the, the diverse sectors that they work with in the Latin American region. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I think we need to highlight that like Chinese investments in Latin America, they are not necessarily harming Latin American countries, right? Like very often they're the only resource these countries have, since like the U.S. doesn't seem really inclined in investing in Latin America. That's also the case in Europe, and we are living in an era of like globalization is reversing, right? So like very often these investments, they are like the only option left for these countries. The problem here is that various surveys in the region, a lot of surveys in the region and a lot of polls, they often get the results that like most people, they are comfortable with Chinese investors, they think they are positive, but when they are not, if you don't have like independent media doing their job and covering this, very often these issues would be overlooked or ignored. We had Margaret Myers is here, like we spoke about this recently. We had a case of like a dam in Ecuador that costed like billions and billions of dollars. It was like mostly funded by Chinese banks. And when they opened the whole infrastructure, it was brand new. It was like a dream for so many decades in Ecuador. There were a lot of flaws to the point that it started like harming the electric grid in Ecuador. And the reason we know that is because like independent journalists that pay attention to this kind of stuff, they were paying attention to this topic and they were willing to follow the money and understand what happened. And that's really important. Like if you're in a situation where like so many media outlets have like contracts with the Chinese, like you're not gonna have an incentive to talk about these issues at best. Sometimes even like self-censorship.
Please.
So I'm very curious to ask you, has there been any prospects of like a Malema philosophy where we have one united Latin America, like, where, because if you look at it this way, peso is the one currency of majority of Latin American countries, Spanish except Brazil. They all speak same language and same currency, same cultures. So has there been a talk of something where like there was one united Africa, like one united Latin America to counter this China influence? And also, what is your perspective on PPPs? Like, why hasn't the government really gone after PPPs within the domestic,
What do you mean by PPP? I'm sorry.
public-private partnerships?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like, why hasn't, it transpired a lot, and all
Does
these countries?
OAS or any other trans-regional organization focus on this
Yeah.
issue?
Yeah, this is not something I researched for my book, so I wouldn't be able to speak about that. In terms of like what you mentioned on like, yeah, some countries speak Spanish. There is Brazil speaking Portuguese, and therefore they have like similar cultures. I tend to disagree, and I think that's why they have been so successful lately, because they understood that it's not because
Say the
like
Chinese.
yeah,
Okay.
it's not because the countries they have like a similar like historical background and culture that they are necessarily reacting to media content in the same way. In fact, like there is a scholar who was like the first person that started like reading about this issue. Actually, Pablo Morales is a professor at London School of Economics, and his research is very interesting because like here I was sort of like outlining the broad strategy, but he focused on like the effects. And there's this paper that he wrote like a couple of years ago. It was like several focus groups that he conducted in Argentina and Mexico. And one of the reasons why the people he interviewed for these researches, like they were not buying the Chinese narrative, was precisely because they felt that the Chinese, they were pushing a specific Spanish accent, like the neutral accent very often used here in the US in like CNN Spanish, for example, that they find condescending and they associate with like colonization stuff. So the fact that they are like, again, going to what Sarah said, like investing in not only in like content in other languages, but using like local dialect, it's very important because it helps like people connect more with the content. Yeah.
Sarah, did you have something here?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I think of the different regions we looked at, it felt that Latin America is the most nascent in terms of this question of kind of responding and having an initial network of even local experts, people like Igor that have the knowledge and understanding to perhaps be more sophisticated in some of this. I think the other thing is that governments, for the most part, because they actually need these partnerships and economic ties with China, are not interested. So then if you're talking about an entity like the OAS, that's mostly state-based, you might not get much interest in that. I don't know if, let's say, a special rapporteur on freedom of expression might be more inclined to understand, interested in this. But again, the tactics being used are very subtle and superficial, and compared to the other very violent threats that journalists in the region face, this feels like, okay, it's not of the same level of urgency, perhaps. So I think that's part of one of the challenges. But at the same time, I do think that you do see a burgeoning network of people, and some of them are folks we worked with in our project, but also others who are taking more of an interest. There are new new online websites, digital websites like Dialogo China, Reporte Asia in Argentina, that are basically trying to create new forums for independent, like local Latin American voices and coverage of the bilateral relationship. Because I think a real challenge is that either you get the Chinese voice or you get, the Western or the US. And I think a lot of people feel like there's an absence of that local voice. And we see that in Africa as well, for example. But there is a new generation, I think, of journalists, writers, think tanks that are doing more in this space. And it's just really great to see. And the more that can be done, honestly, to support them, whether it's maybe not always funding, capacity building, opportunities, I think that's great.
Professor Ellis.
Yes. First, Igor, congratulations on the work. Very impressive. Two brief questions. One, with respect to the journalist trips to China as well as the content sharing agreements. In your work, did you find any differences in approach between the national level relationship building and the local level? Of course, again, as you know, at the local level, oftentimes there are different amounts of resources, different amounts of sophistication and filters in how one interprets what's going on. And just as a second follow-on, you mentioned that the theme, which is a small theme, but potentially important, the acquisition of media outlets. Do you see any trends there in the role that's playing vis-a-vis these other two generally more well-known thing with the trips and the content sharing?
Thank you. Let me start with the last question in terms of acquisition. So like many countries in Latin America, they have very strong laws preventing foreigners from like owning media outlets. But we have some cases that became like primary examples of like this strategy. So like China Radio International, I would say, is at the forefront of this strategy. There is a huge story published by Reuters, so like the news agency, on this topic, where they found that there were like many companies disguised as like national companies buying media outlets, and then like you would find links between them and the Chinese. There was a specific case in Tijuana, Mexico, where they bought this radio station precisely because they wanted to broadcast to the Spanish-speaking communities in California. So like, and they specifically say that like when they announced that they were buying the station, they specifically stated that they were doing it because they wanted to like the Hispanic communities in California to have access to this sort of content. But in general, this is not like a general trend, because like many of these countries, they have very strong protections in terms of like legislation to prevent this from happening. And in terms of like the differences between local and national levels, yeah, you can see that. Like at the local levels, they are less sophisticated often to deal with this, and usually like this additional sum of money they receive for like these contracts is a big help for like the budget of the newsroom and so on. So yeah, like this TV station that I mentioned in Mexico, it's very small, and it became this whole thing online. We have cases in Colombia as well, where like they were signing content sharing agreements, not with the big TV outlets, but with like very local TV stations, sometimes linked with like universities, for example. Very often you would see like the Confucius Institute helping them, like as a bridge between the Chinese media and these universities as well. And very often this amount of money is very welcomed, because these networks, they don't have an infrastructure to compete with the big ones. So it's a big push. Yeah.
Thank you. Please get the microphone and hit the button. You get a green light.
Let me identify myself.
Please.
Rolando Sanchez. Now I'm with a company, International Trade and Communications Corporation. I'm a journalist. I used to cover the White House. Well, anyway, I think that this process that you are describing of China getting into the media in all these countries is very, very complicated. I have many questions about it, but one of them is, it seems that they are favoring companies that have interest in China for the release of all this news. My question is, well, also I want to comment that the public that we on television covered were mainly educated and uneducated. Now, the more educated are very skeptical about government news because they consider it propaganda. My question is, what is the rating that you have found in this trend of China getting in with the news? For example, you have an anchor that gets all this news to be released to the public. He has to select the priority of the news. Where does China stands? If you get a news from China, where do you put it? At the beginning, at the end, in the middle? So what is the interest of the public to read about China? Only financial, government? What is it?
Thank you. So what I heard from many journalists in the region when I went there to talk to them is that, especially after the pandemic, there is a huge demand for China news. And within the newsrooms, there is a lack of expertise and resources to do it independently. So this content sharing agreement, it helps them in the sense that it's filling the gap. It's filling the gap with like content sponsored by the Chinese state, but it is filling the gap in a way. And you see that, like, for example, like Sarah was mentioning about like some of these journalists getting like actual skills when they go to China, and some of them when they go there they learn Chinese. And like I would say, speaking Chinese is not absolutely necessary, but it's very important when you do China news, in the sense of like engaging with like stakeholders in China. And another problem that I talk briefly in the book is the fact that like it is increasingly difficult to get a journalist visa to go to China. There are like a number of requirements that like you have to fill, and many of these media outlets, they don't have the money to do it. Like including, for example, opening a physical bureau in Beijing. Many journalists from these media outlets, when they go for like correspondency posts, like here in the U.S. or Europe, the bureau is at their own house. Like so, like even like an additional cost of like renting a place is something difficult for these media outlets. But not only that, like you have to go through interviews with like the local embassy. You have to be approved by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You have to dedicate a few months being in China, not knowing if you're going to stay there for good or not. To go through like medical appointments, interviews at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so on, with a huge chance of them saying no, or perhaps like giving you a 3-month visa. And like, while you have like newspapers willing to like take the burden and pay for these expenses for the sake of having like original content on Chinese news, more often you would see newspapers going either like subscribing to news wires, like Western news wires, like AP, AFP, Reuters, which is against like the best interests of the Chinese, or using these content sharing agreements and the content that they get from Xinhua to fill this gap. So I had like many journalists saying, oh, so yeah, like whenever I want to see how China stand on a certain point, I use Xinhua. Or when I'm doing the coverage of, let's say, the 2 sessions, which is like the prime legislative meeting that happens in China every year. Did it end already? Like
It's ending up now.
yeah. Also because like Western outlets don't really focus on this, but like they go for like China Daily or CCTV, CGTN, Xinhua, and they republish this content, even if they don't have established content sharing agreement, because like a few years ago, Xinhua offered the Newswire service by Xinhua for free for many of these media outlets. So they have access to photos, videos, and content. So for very specific Chinese news, they have Chinese sources providing them with content. Yeah.
Also remember that if some of these outlets are getting the Xinhua feed, they're getting the Xinhua feed on news worldwide.
Yeah.
Not just about the region, but also coverage of the United States, coverage of elections, coverage of what's going on everywhere else. So
And it's something that like some editors that I talked to, they actually praised. They were like, well, yeah, like perhaps we are not going to use Xinhua very often for like China news, but they are very good in doing like Latin American journalism. For example, Xinhua is the only media outlet that has like a bureau in Cuba. So like you see, there's actually like something that I quoted in my book. where the Chinese, they were like praising the fact that I think there was like a hurricane in Cuba like a few years ago, and Xinhua was the only one at the scene. So they were the ones providing content not only for Latin American outlets, but also for like Western outlets as well, like CNN or BBC. They were like, oh, for like 7 days we had a Chinese face reporting on these issues in Latin America. We were the primary voice for like the events there.
Very often in Africa, Latin America, and other regions, it's not just a story of Chinese presence and activity, it's a story of inactivity and neglect on the part of America and the West. It's not a simple story. Question here, and then one at the
Sorry,
back, two
can
final
I
questions.
chime in one? Oh, go ahead.
Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Roberta Lajo, a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I am a retired Mexican diplomat. Thank you very much. I think this is mind-opening. I will read it carefully. I would tell you, speaking for my country, they have been very successful. I mean, the image of China in Mexico is very positive in spite of the fact that we have a tremendous trade deficit and that ingredients for fentanyl and other issues that we have with China go unnoticed or whatever. And my question goes to the following. Have you gone to study not only the media directly, but who has influence in that media? I mean, talking about Mexicans themselves. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think of the study centers that study China. They obviously become propaganda for China, and there's the people who speak theoretically as academics are speaking in the media very favorably about everything that has to do with China. Mm-hmm. Second, the question of the diaspora. I mean, there is a Chinese diaspora in every country of the world. And for instance, when I think of the case of Mexico, in the Pacific cities, they become more influential as businessmen and also become sort of intermediaries with doing trade and with doing business with China. And they are very favorable of every action towards China. And the third issue would be the former communist parties. I mean, they don't exist as such anymore, but they have a very strong political tradition and a very strong group around. They're very close, tight-knit. I mean, I'm talking parties that were founded in the 1920s, and since then have evolved into leftist parties and have grown. And having not anymore the Soviet Union as a reference, they do have China as a reference. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's take one last question, then we'll go to Igor and to Sarah for final comments, please.
Igor, thank you very, very much. This is fantastic. Just one data. Xinhua opened in Cuba in 1960. It has been the first and the only Xinhua office in Latin America. On the one point you previously made, that I agree with you, non-Western media outlets, Russia Today, for instance, is now the biggest Spanish-speaking broadcast that exists in the world. Hispan TV, Iranian-backed, has also a massive presence in Latin America. So you are absolutely right. The influence of non-Western media in Latin America is very, very strong. The problem is the U.S. reaction. Because when I heard that on the media level, there is U.S. competence toward China, Russia, Iran, no, there is not. There is U.S. stigmatization and demonization of media, not competence. Because with the amount of resources that U.S. media have and the amount of influence, because you can, Igor, you know better than me, when you go to Latin America, you talk about Iran. Iran is another galaxy. China, yes, China has a more, Latin American people are more knowledgeable about China, but still is a far away reality. The U.S. is above. And still, the U.S. never initiated a project to compete on the media level with China, Iran, and Russia. For your research, why do you believe this happens? Is a problem of presumption? Is a problem of arrogance? Is a problem of heritage? Because, you know, it has gone well for 100 years, so it will go well for another 100. But the reality is that the world changes. So your thought on that?
All right. Yeah, so about like the first question, yes. So like many journalists, they, especially in Mexico, actually, I spoke with a few of them there. They say that like they often interview Mexican scholars specialized in China to get like how like the local scholars perceive this engagement, but like these are also scholars going to China for exchange programs, getting money from them, getting resources and praise. This is not only in Mexico. This happens a lot in Brazil as well, in Argentina, and it's very clear. Like when you open like the Twitter feed or like how they engage with like media, how like they talk about these topics. Not all of them, but with some of them, it's pretty much like listening to a Chinese scholar affiliated with the government. They use the same talking points, the same vocab. So, and I feel that like this is a bigger problem. It's a lack of expertise that goes beyond media. It's a lack of expertise in China studies. And I mentioned this in the book. Like, so for example, in Brazil, when I went back to Brazil and I tried to like get my diploma recognized, that was a big problem. Why? Because there is no university in Brazil doing China studies. And according to the law, a university doing like a similar program, they need to verify what you study. And because there was like no one offering this sort of like courses there, technically I cannot recognize my diploma there. And like in Argentina, we have some independent courses in like in universities teaching about like China studies. So like Argentina has been doing a great job in this sense, but that's not the case for most countries I researched. About diaspora, we actually discussed about this. This is something that I perhaps would like to discuss in a second book because it's totally different. The content like provided to the Chinese diaspora in these regions, often in Chinese, varies a lot from what they do for like the international audiences in general. There's also another like factor. I'm not going to go into much detail because we don't have much time, but there's another factor there, which, and that's the fact that many of these Chinese from the Chinese diaspora, they get news from WeChat. And WeChat, as we know, is heavily censored by the CCP as well. So there is a different dynamic. We thought about doing this about like diaspora when I was doing my field research. We even discussed a trip to Peru, but at that time Peru was under like a lot of chaos, as you guys probably know. So it wasn't safe to go there. Perhaps this is a topic I'd like to tackle in the future for a second book. And on your question about why the U.S. never engaged in like doing something to counter the Chinese. So like first of all, yes, you're correct. Like I think. Very often, the way like these major media outlets in the U.S. they cover China is not factual. Of course, like the media coverage is not isolated from how a country operates, right? So, like, of course, it comes with the U.S. interests and the way the U.S. perceives China. As we were talking earlier, here China is pretty much perceived as a threat. That's not the case in Latin America, and that's one of the reasons why I advocate for like Latin America to have independent media doing this, because it's not about loving or hating China. It's about deciding what we want from them and what is good and what is not. And right now, I don't think we have knowledge enough to understand what is good and what is not, and what's the best. In terms of why the U.S. never like did something to counter China or Russia or Iran or like recently Venezuela as well, it also goes with the fact that the way these countries perceive media is very different, right? Like media here in the U.S. is very commercial. For these countries, not necessarily. And media tends to different goals in different countries. For the U.S., it's primarily about capital, about making money, about like reaching broader audiences because that's going to be converted in revenue for the network. As of China and Russia, it's about like spreading the scope and reach of the diplomacy and the talking points. So in that sense, I think it's very difficult because like convincing the U.S. of doing something similar would be convincing the U.S. to engage in propaganda, and that's not helpful at all. It would fall in the same problems that we're discussing here.
Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yes, I think the point that was raised about how these other sectors intersect with the media space is very important. We did actually look at the diaspora in many countries, and if
Yeah.
you look at the country case studies for the Beijing's Global Media Influence Report, there's a short segment there on the Chinese diaspora media. And just in general, that is a really important avenue of influence because it's pretty much, in most cases, very much dominated by Chinese state media or local outlets with close ties that are part of this network, as well as what Igor mentioned about WeChat. I think the other element of this lack of independent expertise. So one example that came up in Panama, which was one of the case studies, was our researcher was interviewing some journalists there, and they were like, "Well, we wanted to get a comment on this issue, so we went either to the Chinese embassy or to the Confucius Institute at one of the universities because that was who was available." So that element of really building up kind of local expertise is so important. And then on the censorship side, it's the same thing, including when you have diaspora initiatives or efforts to present an alternative voice. So the Shenyun Performing Arts Company that does this, that is based in the US, travels around the world. They actually ran into the Chinese diplomats do a very aggressive campaign to try to get theaters to cancel their performances, including in Latin America. And this came up tangentially in our research. Peru, Mexico, Dominican Republic. What was actually great is that the local theaters often would push back and the local officials pushed back. And so they were able to perform and present, a different view of China than what you might see from the party state. But that's not only the Shenyun case. We see cases of an Australian, cartoonist in Poland who tries to do this. So I think one of the challenges is that even when you have members of the diaspora that are trying, whether it's artistically or vocally or writing articles, the Chinese diplomats, it's a very high priority for them to suppress and marginalize any alternative or critical voice among the Chinese diaspora. So that adds then another layer of complexity and challenge for local audiences who want to hear from a non-Chinese party state voice about China from Chinese people. So anyway, I'll just say that I think the media and the influence is just this one part of this really larger microcosm, I would say, of macro, of these influence efforts and how they intersect, as well as the local response and resilience. So that'll just be my thought. Just to end on that, it's just so encouraging to see just the level of development of local voices now and looking at this like Igor. And it's really different from what it was just 10 years ago. And I think just allows for so much more nuance and effectiveness and ultimately improving the quality of news that people are accessing and the space for journalists to do this kind of work.
So again, Igor's book is Hearts and Minds, Votes and Contracts, China's State Media in Latin America. For those of you who are watching online, the book is available online at the Wilson Center's website. For those of you who are here, I hope that you all have a copy. If you would like additional copies, there are a few more here in the room, but if you want more yet, please come see me. We can get those for you. I also encourage you, if you're interested in these questions of China's relations in Latin America, go to the website of our Latin America program at Wilson. We've had an extraordinary run of experts in these issues over the past 5 or 6 years, not just on the media side, but economics and political relations. Please come see their work. Thank you, all of us, for joining at Wilson, and thank you, Sarah, and especially thank you, Igor, for your research and all the work that you've done here to bring our attention to these issues. Thank you, and good day to all of you.